Okay, brilliant. So I think we're going to get started now. I'll just let anybody else that's coming in sort of as we go. So firstly, hi to those of you who don't know me. I'm Kate. I'm the chair of UEA Labour. So I'm going to be chairing this discussion on anti-Semitism and Labour. Now we've got a brilliant guest, somebody who I think a lot of you will have seen on the news recently, sort of making quite a distinct case on anti-Semitism. The brilliant Barnaby Raine. So do you want to introduce yourself, Barnaby?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Barnaby. I am a PhD student in history at Columbia University, and I also teach at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research as well as Columbia. And so you can catch my classes there if you're interested. And I'm writing a PhD about visions at the end of capitalism. And I'm interested in the question why it became harder to think the end of capitalism and to think this question of transition, the transition from capitalism to socialism, why that became a harder thing to think over the course of the 20th century. And so that interest has made me turn in recent years, quite accidentally, to preoccupation with the question of anti-Semitism, which I understand as one of the awful kinds of demons that emerges in the wake of the decline of more radical and emancipatory forms of anti-capitalism. So I'm very glad to be with you today and to talk about such a horrible topic, but I hope to make it interesting.
Great, thanks for that. So just before we jump right in, for those of you who haven't been to our events before, the way they're usually structured is we have a handful of set questions for the first half that we discuss with whoever's on the panel, and then afterwards we open up to a Q&A. So you can either, if you think of any questions as we're going along, you can pop them in the chat and we can read them out and discuss them once the set questions are done, or you can just chip in at the end and sort of ask anything personally that you specifically want to say. That's no problem. And also, just so everyone's aware, we are going to be recording this to go up on our UEA Labour YouTube channel. So of course, if you don't want your face to be in that, or you're concerned about privacy and things, feel free to just stop the video aspect on your laptop. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in. So the first question we have, first set question, is quite a broad one to begin with. So Britain is, of course, built upon racism. So it's been integral to our history and to our culture, from the slave trade through to Oswald Mosley's fascists and sort of the minstrel programs that you got sort of from the 50s onwards. So how has anti-Semitism sort of differed from those other forms of racism that we've seen?
Great question. So a lot to say about this. So forgive me for giving you a long answer, and then I'll hopefully be quicker about other things. But there's so much to say about how anti-Semitism is specific and how it isn't, because one of the problems under which we're laboring is a dominant account of what anti-Semitism is, an account which has become pretty much ubiquitous, which interests me for the kinds of social functions that it serves, but not for its accuracy. And this is the account that's called the new anti-Semitism, from writers like Robert Wistrich and David Hirsch and others, which treats anti-Semitism as fundamentally different from other kinds of bigotry, so that it's useless for Jeremy Corbyn to say, I can't be an anti-Semite, I've been lifelong anti-racist, because on this view, and I think this view has sort of crept into much of our mainstream discourse, anti-Semitism is simply totally different from, say, white supremacy or Islamophobia. Because those are forms of prejudice that punch down, that target the disadvantaged, whereas anti-Semitism is something radical, appealing on the left, because it punches up and it targets privilege and rich, successful Jews. You'll notice immediately how this picture of anti-Semitism requires accepting an anti-Semitic picture of what Jews are, that we're all rich and powerful. So that anti-Semitism comes to look like a form of radicalism. And the great power of this narrative is it allows mainstream liberals and conservatives to see a kind of shadowy presence behind the reappearance of radical politics after 2008, after the financial crash, so that any kind of antagonistic anti-elitism might have behind it the shadow of this really awful thing, anti-Semitism. So you can cloud your fears, you can understand in your own mind your fears about anything from Jeremy Corbyn to Black Lives Matter. You can understand those those fears about radicalism as being progressive fears, because you're trying to protect Jews from these scary radicals. And so the real anti-Semites are Palestinians or Muslims or the left. This view kind of really began in France in the 1990s and early 2000s when it was targeted against young people in the banlieue. So that's a right-wing account of anti-Semitism as a particular danger. And I think we've lost, most of us on the left, the ability to have our own account. So what is a better account? Well, we should start by understanding that there are distinctive social functions served by different kinds of bigotry. It's not to say they're deliberately authored by some clique trying to deliver these functions, but they come to serve different functions. So Islamophobia might be extremely powerful and useful in legitimating imperial wars abroad. Transphobia might be extremely useful in policing a porous gender binary, right? These different bigotries serve different functions. Anti-Semitism then clearly slots in a distinctive category, which is it is a kind of ostensibly anti-elitist discourse which serves to funnel discontent against a world of power and inequality in directions that are not really about fundamentally challenging that world. So it doesn't say get rid of all, it doesn't say the problem is all finance capital, it just says the problem, well, it doesn't say the problem is all capital, it says the problem is just parasitic finance capital. And then it doesn't say the problem is just finance capital, it says the problem is just the Rothschilds or Soros. So it's a way of directing, and I'm interested in why this is appealing in certain historical moments, it's a way of directing and understanding an anger with power and inequality in a way that isn't a fundamental challenge to capitalist society. So that, I think, is the sort of distinctive social function that anti-Semitism serves, which, if you see it that way, you understand why it's kind of facile to compare it to other forms of bigotry and say, are Jews suffering as much as, say, Black people in America? Clearly not, or even Muslims in Britain. They're not Jews are not targeted by state power like Muslims are in Britain, of course. But these are different prejudices that serve different functions, and the dangers of prejudice is not just the particular harms they cause to the group in question, but the more general kind of ideological pattern they set, which can be fatal for the left. I'd like to talk about a little bit then about why anti-Semitism is I think, rising now and why it's such a conservative thing. Shall I do that, or do you want to ask me another question? Am I going over my time?
No, absolutely, go for it. The floor is yours.
Okay, so I think so. You asked how anti-Semitism is different. I think one thing that we should understand from the get-go is why it is a conservative form of thinking, unlike the view which we see dominant in much of our mainstream media now, either explicitly or just implicitly hinted at, that it's something radical because it's about taking on power, taking on the rich. The two central conservative devices in anti-Semitism are, firstly, that it thinks conspiratorially about the world, so that it salvages the image of our society by saying, if you experience problems, if you're unemployed, or if you feel powerless in your work, if you feel a kind of alienation and lack of control, this is not a problem structured into the very logic of the social relations that govern your society. Instead, it's a much more superficial problem. It's a small cabal that can be easily zapped. It's not all banks, it's just George Soros, right? So an analogy, I think, is the way that some liberals in both Britain and America talk about Putin today. So the way to understand in their shock and trauma at the Trump election victory in 2016 or the Brexit result in 2016 is, rather than asking fundamental questions about how their societies produced these results, they say, oh my God, it's a tiny group of Russian hackers who've got into the process and spun it all. So these are kind of reassuring devices to avoid asking fundamental questions about your social relations. And so that's what conspiratorial thinking does, and anti-Semitism is one very powerful brand of that thinking. Secondly, anti-Semitism isn't just conspiratorial. It also makes social and political problems into ethnic or cultural or racial problems, right? It doesn't just say the problem is a tiny group of bankers rather than the whole of capitalist social relations. It also says, why are those bankers a problem? Not because of their constructed social position in banks, but because of something in their blood or something in their culture or something in their faith, which is peculiarly different from us. So that, again, our society is broadly healthy. We just have to expunge this alien other. And that's the problem. So these are the two deeply conservative impulses in anti-Semitism, which, if they take hold, I think are extremely damaging for the possibility of a left-wing anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and so on. Why are they so powerful now? I think about this through three dates: 1989, 9/11, 2008. So in 1989, we were told that history had ended, very famous claim from Francis Fukuyama, right? Very influential claim. At the end of the Cold War, we were told that fundamental social transformation was impossible. Capitalism was here to stay for good. And that transformed the dynamic of politics in most Western countries, indeed in much of the world. In 9/11 and after 9/11, people discovered that actually politics was possible again. It was possible to have your fundamental antagonisms, as long as they were cultural rather than about social transformation. You could have burghers facing off against burqas, right? And so the politics of the war on terror rediscovered the kinds of grand clashes of politics that in the 1990s we'd been told had been rendered impossible by the end of the Cold War. But the whole language of the war on terror was to understand those grand clashes as proceeding on cultural terms. Right, the clashes were, as Huntington famously had it, a clash of civilizations, right? Then in 2008, we had an economic crash and the need again to have a language, a political language of the economy, which had been missing for so long. And so I think in the midst of that quest for a political language of the economy, understanding power and wealth as threats, after a decade of cultural language, where we had reacted to the impossibility of fundamental social transformation by saying the problem is just some cultural others. Well, Islamophobia couldn't, Islamophobia could speak to cultural anxieties about security. Anti-Semitism gave a cultural rendering to anxieties about the economy. The problem is George Soros. So in a deeply pessimistic moment in which you can't end the world, or sorry, end capitalism, awful slip, you can't transform the world and end capitalism. All you can do is get rid of a much smaller, more superficial problem. And I think in the shadow of the war on terror, the way that people have been told increasingly to think about politics is in these kinds of cultural terms, finding others and seeing them as the problem. So that's my account of why anti-Semitism is on the rise now and what's so distinctive about it.
Absolutely, thanks for that. I mean, sort of leading on from those different narratives and those different aspects of anti-Semitism and its nature, the sort of popular narrative that's been perpetuated by the media really since 2015 purports that sort of Corbyn's election was a watershed moment in which anti-Semitism and bigotry more generally became rife within the Labour Party, and this implies, of course, that Labour, was the pre-Corbyn Labour was a party that sided with minorities and that got this stuff and was strong on it. So how accurate is this sort of landscape for you?
It is totally inaccurate and revealingly so. I should say first that in response to this campaign, the left has often been forced into or felt forced into choosing between two bad options. So in response to a campaign which said there is this problem of bigotry and it's on the left has tended to give up the ground of anti-racism to the right by adopting either a kind of apologetics or a kind of denialism. So denialism is the right is accusing you of having loads of bigots and you say, this is all bullshit, this is crazy, we don't have any bigots, there's no bigotry on the left, which is a bit like in the old days, people wanting to say there was no misogyny or homophobia on the left because these were clearly charges that could be easily exploited by our enemies. A properly radical understanding of our society and the ideological dangers it breeds would understand, would be confident about having an analysis of anti-Semitism, including its presence on the left, rather than feeling the need to deny the existence of it, just as a properly feminist critique can situate itself on the left and also critique the left for its patriarchal and misogynistic tendencies. So denialism gives over to the right the ground of anti-racism, says, yes, you're the anti-racists, we're the ones denying that racism is really a problem. And then the other option, amid this right-wing campaign against the left, is accommodation, which are apologetics, which is to say, oh my God, yes, you're right, there's loads of anti-Semitism, and so your account of what anti-Semitism is must be right, and so we must adopt your measures for dealing with it, like, for example, trying to shut down a lot of solidarity with the Palestinian people, or like trying to decry, a Labour MP said that anti-capitalism is anti-Semitic. This is the kind of crap that you get from the right. And if on the left we accept the right's account of what anti-Semitism is, then we feel forced into a horrible choice between accommodation with that kind of stuff or just denying it's a problem. So I'm trying to set out a third path, a left-wing account of anti-Semitism, and part of that account situates anti-Semitism within a climate of other bigotries, and so would have absolutely no time at all for the current mainstream idea though it's a revealing and it's a telling one, that liberal centrist politicians are serious anti-racists, and the problem of racism is merely a problem of the fringes. This is central to how liberals think about anti-racism, right? Anti-racism is about bad ideas in the heads of a few bad apples, whereas radical critique, certainly Marxism, the kind of tradition I come from, is a theory not of the bad apples, but of the barrel, right? How was it that a certain kind of society came to look a certain way and generated certain kinds of thinking? So rather than saying there are these unreasonable anti-Semites and they're weird bigots or unreasonable Islamophobes or white supremacists or whatever it is, we would instead see how racism has been threaded through the mainstream of British public life because Britain is an imperial and then post-colonial country which first colonized and abused huge numbers of people around the world and then tried to deal with the legacies of that in all sorts of quite sort of nasty ways. So Labour governments and Labour parties in opposition have had racism running through them in the attempt to deal with that imperial present and then post-colonial challenges. In the 1940s, a Labour conference suggested ethnic cleansing, population transfer of the Palestinian people, freely passed motion in a Labour conference. Clement Attlee received letters of protest from Labour MPs and seriously considered suspending immigration of black people to Britain because he was worried about what it would do to Britain's national identity. The Labour government then in the Wilson government in 1965 produced a white paper on immigration. 1968 passed legislation deliberately trying to keep out black British citizens from migrating to Britain from Kenya when they were being expelled from Kenya. So the history of the Labour Party as a party that sought to show that it could be an efficient guardian of the British state apparatus involved repeated attempts to demonstrate their fealty to the racism of that apparatus and to its not just contingent chance racism, but its entanglement in imperial and post-colonial histories that kind of demanded racism of it. And then more recently in our own times, New Labour used racism, very aggressive, sort of almost constant undercurrent of racism as a mechanism of distinguishing themselves from the loony left, which had been anti-racist in the past, people like Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, and proving that they were trustworthy and mainstream, because to be mainstream in Britain has meant being racist. And so that meant David Blunkett as Home Secretary going on tirades against lefty lawyers representing bogus asylum seekers. This stuff had real material effects in the Labour government banning asylum seekers from working while they were seeking asylum, so that very, very desperate people were forced. A Home Affairs Committee report, I think it was in Parliament, parliamentary committee said, forced deliberately into destitution, refugees forced deliberately into destitution. Why? So that this new Labour government could show how tough they were on the poor and the foreign. At the same time, of course, the constant attacks on Muslim communities as a fifth column. Muslim kids told by one new Labour Home Secretary that they should be spying on their parents. Collusion, of course, in the awful global racism of the Bush war on terror, which meant attempts to detain for up to 90 days without charge people accused of terror offences. Obviously largely it was going to be Muslims, attempt to introduce ID cards, collusion in torture, very violent kinds of racially directed hatred written into the core of the Labour Party. They didn't care about racism. I mean, they used to mock the very term Islamophobia. Polly Toynbee, liberal commentator, I think once said she was proud to be called an Islamophobe or something like that, mocked the very idea of Islamophobia as a real thing. This was the war on terror. They weren't embarrassed by the fact that they were frightened of Muslims. Because they kind of cast a worrying net of suspicion over a whole community when dealing with only a tiny number of extremists in actuality. The prevent agenda, spying on surveilling Muslims to see if they adhere to British values, all of this stuff has its origins in New Labour policy. So the attacks, especially on migrants and Muslims, was central to New Labour. And going back before that, racism against former imperial subjects has a long and deep history in the Labour Party. So the idea that Labour's always been anti-racist is one of the great absurdities and untruths that we have to crack open.
Brilliant. I think, leading on from that and looking at the Labour Party as it is now, we've obviously recently had the EHRC report on anti-Semitism within the party. So what are your feelings about that report and the aftermath that ensued with the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn?
So I think that the report is interesting as a kind of sad finale, swan song to the context of the to the strange panic that has preoccupied the British press about anti-Semitism on the left, and which has similar reflections in panics that have taken place in France, in Germany to some extent, certainly in the United States, seeing anti-Semitism as a kind of radical disease of the left. Because here you have a body tasked not with generating sensationalist headlines, but doing a serious investigation. And what they find is that the Labour Party doesn't look like the one political organisation they previously investigated, the BNP, which obviously is full of open racists. Instead, they find just 2 cases of people who are agents of the Labour Party, so elected officials for whom the Labour Party can be held accountable, who they think have sort of legally actionable cases for anti-Semitism. Both of these are people who were expelled or left the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. They don't, in other words, find a huge sea of stuff. Now, I don't say that to minimize the real existence of anti-Semitism across society, which all the polling bears out. And the polling bears out that it's not like there's a huge drop-off and there's no anti-Semitism on the left and it's all on the right. Neither is it like the kind of dominant media picture where it's all on the left. But people on the left, I'm saying, shouldn't be complacent. And I don't mean to induce complacency by saying this. But there is always a notable contrast between factual, serious investigations and sensationalist media language on this issue. Indeed, a Home Affairs Committee report a few years ago gave us YouGov polling on the actual spread of anti-Semitic attitudes, fairly even across right to left, slightly higher on the right. And then polling about what people, Jewish people in Britain and others, thought about anti-Semitism. And they found that most people thought it was largely on the left. And this incongruity just went sort of without question. So the EHRC report is an important document, in part for once again demonstrating that while there are problems, in 2016, there was a councillor raving about Rothschilds, for example. I don't want a Labour councillor talking like that. I don't want anyone who claims to be a socialist talking like that, engaging in that kind of stuff. So the report showed that there are problems, and it also showed that the scale was not the same as, about 50% of Tory party members in one survey think that Islam is a threat to Britain's way of life. If 50% of Labour Party members thought Judaism was a threat to Britain's way of life, you'd have found much more muck being sort of spurned up, chewed up in this report, coming up in this report. The report is also a kind of sad statement of this saga because of some of its strange presumptions. So here you have the EHRC, which has refused 3 requests from the Muslim Council of Britain to investigate Islamophobia in the Tory party. Here you have the EHRC, a kind of institution of New Labour liberal anti-racism, understanding racism as something which the state bodies can target in a few fringe bad apples, whether they're on the far right or the far left. Here you have the EHRC having its funding cut by Tory government since 2010, so that it's a shadow of its former self, with the only Muslim commissioner resigning, black commissioners saying it's not serious about tackling racism, refusing the politically difficult work of taking on respectable racism, that is the racism of Islamophobia in the Tory party, which is echoed every day in the tabloid press, and instead going the easy way of pursuing what is already a media campaign against anti-Semitism only on the left. We literally have a prime minister who wrote an anti-Semitic novel, caricatures of Jewish businessmen with hook noses, and yet we have only investigations about the left. I don't want to be the person defending the left and saying there's no anti-Semitism there. It's just the unevenness of it is so damaging. Because it makes people skeptical about the whole work of fighting racism. So the very nature of the sort of investigation highlights that unevenness. And then some of the assumptions of the investigation, like the idea that even declaring that you think that this campaign against anti-Semitism has been wielded for political ends might constitute harassment against Jewish people. Some of those assumptions, I think, speak to much of the politics of our contemporary era, in which we understand anti-racism as being about avoiding hurting the feelings of certain homogenous communities, rather than, as we used to understand it, a material process of changing apparatuses of power which target communities, and ideological forms of thinking which target communities. Instead, this has become all about, anti-racism has become all about asking people whether their feelings have been hurt. And I think there's been a huge transformation in how we think about racism that you see reflected in the EHRC document as well. So much more to say about it, but basically I think it's an interesting document. I think its use to suspend, the use of it to suspend Jeremy Corbyn by Keir Starmer is a classic example of exactly what Jeremy Corbyn was complaining about in the statement that got him suspended, which is how some people who are not really very serious about fighting racism will try to use the issue of anti-Semitism as their factional battering ram to attack the left. So obviously suspending Jeremy Corbyn for saying, after he said, not only are anti-Semites not welcome in the Labour Party, not only does he admit that anti-Semitism is a presence on the left, but also that he doesn't want anyone who denies anti-Semitism is a presence on the left even to consider themselves supporters of his. He rejects their support. After saying all that, and also saying that clearly the campaign has also been used for nasty political ends by people who don't really care about Jews or about anti-Semitism. Suspending him for saying these things is just evidence, I think, that Keir Starmer sees anti-Semitism as a factional tool rather than as a serious form of bigotry to be combated.
Definitely, I think that definitely chimes with my own experience of, conversations with people about anti-Semitism and the way in which it's used to kind of, opportunistically sort of score points into kind of it's a faux anti-racism. And the sort of the system that you've just described, is one that we have responsibility to tackle collectively, both, Jews and our allies. And, what would a genuinely, left-wing, genuinely anti-racist vision look like, and how do we get there?
It would look like insisting on more radicalism, not less. So the brutal and destructive thing about this idea of the new anti-Semitism is that it tells mainstream technocratic liberals and conservatives that the problem is radicalism, that the problem is anti-elitism, the problem is antagonistic politics, because all of these things have lurking behind them the dark shadow of potential anti-Semitism. And so what we need is just more less polarized, happy mainstream liberal democracy. In fact, if anti-Semitism is a brutal and awful form of and perverted and fetishistic form of expressing a discontent with wealth and power, what we need is to challenge it with more radical structural accounts of the truth of capitalism as a system not of small conspiracies controlling the world, but a system of impersonal domination in which capital, the value form in some traditions of Marxism that I'm interested in, is a social form with a logic that envelops us whether we like it or not. Whether even if a boss tries to be really nice to their workers, if they raise their wages too much, the boss will just go out of business. It's not a question of the boss's nasty intentions. That's not the story of capitalism. So we need a more radical account which tells people that they shouldn't express their frustrations in the form of conspiratorial theories, but instead proper anti-capitalism. And similarly, they shouldn't think of problems of carnage abroad, including in Palestine, as the problem, as religious problems of Jewish lobbies or Jewish Zionists or whatever it is, but should have a structural account of global histories of settler colonialism and imperialism stretching from the colonization of the Americas through to the southern tip of Africa, to Australasia, to now the one live case of settler colonial violence in the world, Palestine. And so they should express unambiguous solidarity with the Palestinian people in their quest for freedom and justice, and not think that doing so means betraying the fight against anti-Semitism. Quite the opposite. Doing so properly is the only position which is loyal to a genuine anti-racism, which says everyone everywhere should live in freedom. And if you believe that everyone everywhere should live in freedom, then you combat anti-Semitic tropes wherever you find them, on the right or the left, and you understand how they pervert and destroy the cause of freedom for all by pinning the blame for our problems on tiny conspiracies and falsely misdirecting our attention. And at the same time, you struggle with equal vigor against the network of checkpoints and blockades that imprison the Palestinian people today. So anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, solidarity with Palestine, all of these things are not just consistent with the fight against anti-Semitism, they should be knitted together with the fight against anti-Semitism.
Massively, and thank you for that. I think this sort of brings an end to the first half of this event. So the second half is now opening up to a Q&A. We have had one question put in the chat, which you've already kind of touched upon in your answers to the last one. But building upon the idea of, the need to stand in full solidarity with the Palestinian people and fight, unapologetically for their rights. What language can we use, and what language should be avoided when we're looking to sort of make the case for that?
That's
from George Macy.
That is a great question. One thing to say is never buy into the view that anti-Zionism can be okay until it spills over, this is some of the language we see used, into anti-Semitism. In other words, there might be a certain kind of moderate criticism of the state of Israel, which would be okay. But when it becomes too radical, too militant, then it gets all dodgy. This is the kind of attempt to get us to police our language, which can be highly destructive of a politics of solidarity. Think instead that the most militant, radical, hard line solidarity with the Palestinian people has absolutely nothing in common with anti-Semitism when it is premised on a belief in universal human dignity, which therefore has no time at all for the Zionist state and for the structures of Israeli occupation. And equally, the most tepid, moderate, soft, quiet anti-Zionism, which only has an issue with, a few settlements here and there, can be anti-Semitic if its issue is premised on the idea that there's something peculiarly Jewish about this problem. So, I don't want people to be policing their language in a sense of thinking that they have to get more moderate in order to avoid being anti-Semitic. Instead, foreground the language of freedom. So don't just talk about the brutalities of Israel or the Israel lobby abroad. Talk instead and be admiring about the tradition of a Palestinian people who have been occupied and driven from their homes and dispossessed since at least 1948. People who were treated as playthings by British colonialism, who could just be moved around. Winston Churchill said, a manger belongs to a baby, even if there's, I've forgotten what, a dog, he said, if there's a dog in the manger, you just move the dog away to give it to the baby. That's how he talked about the Palestinians. The Labour Party, similarly, totally casual about ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. These people who have been abused and mistreated and seen as chattel by colonial powers, and now by the American state, and of course by the Israeli state too, have reacted to that in all sorts of ways. But some of the ways they've reacted to that have been very inspiring, right? That they have continued to prize a struggle to return to their homes and to live a life of peace and freedom and security. And that tradition of saying, we will not give up, we will fight, which you saw in the peaceful return marches from Gaza, gunned down by IDF soldiers, where people said, we are going to fly kites and try to return to the homes you stole from us. That, I think, should speak to a desire for dignity that runs through all of our veins. And so you should feel free in speaking about the beauties of that uncompromising, unswerving desire for human freedom, which the Palestinian people have in common with so many of the people around the world who've been colonized and abused. It's what, there's an amazing interview with Chris Hani, the great anti-apartheid leader, you can find on YouTube, long interview, and he finishes it by saying it was just amazing for him to return from exile to South Africa and to be able to watch, he says, the Black South African people who had endured a cruelty few other people had endured, and how they continued to fight on and to believe that they should be able to live and breathe the air of freedom. That kind of spirit should inspire us in the Palestinian people, and we should never accept anyone who tells us that we have to apologize for being inspired by that. They are the racists. They are the racists, the people who tell us that it's unacceptable to be disgusted by the policy of brutalization against the Palestinian people. And so in terms of not feeling the need to moderate yourself, it's not the case, for example, that if you support a two-state solution, then you're okay. But if you don't think that there should be in any part of Palestine a state premised on the idea that I can go and live there, even though I was born and grew up in London, but someone whose grandmother was kicked out of Jerusalem can't go back there. If you think that in no part of Palestine should there be an Israeli state on those principles, then of course you must be a bigot. We should never accept that kind of language. We should be utterly confident in our anti-racism and in demanding freedom for all of Palestine and for all of the Palestinian people. And the right to return, is central to that.
Brilliant, absolutely. Solidarity with that. We've got another question in from Louis. Louis, do you want to ask your own question, or do you want me to read it out? Okay, I assume you want me to read it out then. So it's quite similar to the first question I asked, but you can just give a very quick précis. How would you describe the difference between anti-Semitism and other forms of, I assume he means other forms of other racist views rather than other anti-racist views?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was trying to talk about at first, so I don't want to go over all the same ground. What I was saying before is that it's important to understand different bigotries as serving different kinds of social functions. And I think that it has long been the case, this is not something new, that the social function of anti-Semitism is to channel anti-elitist discontent with the existing social order and discontent with power and wealth in that social order, to channel such discontent in directions which are not emancipatory and not transformative, but in fact really quite moderate, which just say there's a small conspiracy to be zapped rather than the whole structure of your society being at fault. That is the distinctive power of anti-Semitism. Islamophobia can't normally do that. White supremacy can't normally do that. Islamophobia might target your feeling of insecurity because you feel threatened in terms of your physical safety or your geopolitical safety. White supremacy in America might target your sense of insecurity by punching down and saying there are black people who are going to come and steal your home. Anti-Semitism is clearly, those two things are clearly distinct, and anti-Semitism is clearly distinct from both of them in that it gives you a language to articulate your discontent with power. It gives you a language for doing that within terms that are not revolutionary. The really important question for the left, and this is the question that isn't often enough asked, then becomes, under what kinds of material conditions does that sort of politics, a non-revolutionary ostensible anti-elitism, become appealing to people? Why is it that people choose to be worried about George Soros rather than saying we need to abolish the whole of global capitalism? And I think that that's the really important question, because it gets at some of the difficulties of our moment. We shouldn't treat people as idiots or just think we need to just hand them a sort of left-wing propaganda manual and then they'll understand. I think we should treat widespread forms of consciousness more seriously than that. And we should understand then that people turn to these more conservative kind of what might look to us like cop-out anti-elitisms, supposed anti-elitisms, precisely because they lose hope in the possibility of something more radical and dramatic and transformative. And this is where my interest in this question links to my PhD research on the decline of thinking about the end of capitalism. It's precisely when it becomes harder to imagine a serious transition out of capitalist social relations that you instead take comfort in the idea, well, at least I can drain the swamp in Washington by getting rid of some Goldman Sachs lobbyists. That's the most I can do if I'm a miserable Rust Belt voter. Whereas maybe 50 years ago, I might have been sympathetic to the Communist Party and thought that I could do more radical things. I don't believe that anymore. And so anti-Semitism sort of enters and becomes widespread and popular in moments of pessimism for the left. That's why our urgent challenge is to raise again the serious possibility of more dramatic social transformation, and to work out, which we haven't done, I think, how to make that possibility real and compelling, and what it would even look like. I think we have to start from first principles.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got the next questions come in from Owen, which is, so the couple who went on Newsnight, who said that they would not feel safe in the UK if Corbyn won the election. I assume it was a Jewish couple. I don't think I saw this. This seemed an entirely baseless claim, but as a non-Jewish person, it became difficult to voice this without facing accusations of ignoring the lived experiences of Jews. How can we on the left go against this lack of need for fact, but simply evidencing the anti-Semitism on the left because feelings of made a lot of mistakes here, mate. God.
No, I understand. I think I understand. Yeah. The first thing is to be sensitive and careful and take people seriously. So sometimes if people say things that sound ridiculous to you, you might be inclined to think they're being cynical or that they're acting in bad faith. And that is an easy way to avoid the really difficult and actually really interesting question, which is how forms of thinking that seem crazy to you become widespread. So just as I'm interested in the question, how does anti-Semitism, how does the belief in George Soros controlling the world and controlling every central bank or whatever it is, how does that obviously strange claim become appealing to some people? Equally, it's very important to ask how the idea that Jeremy Corbyn is a violent threat to British Jews who would ban kosher slaughter or whatever it is, to ask how that question becomes, how that belief becomes seriously appealing to many Jews is an important question to ask. Now, in order to ask that question, I think, and others may disagree with me here, that we have to step away from a form of politics which has become widespread on the left in recent years, which is the unquestioning veneration of this category, lived experience. Lived experience is a central category in radical politics from the 1950s. You see it central in Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, for example. The term is used, that's the English translation used in both texts. And it's used very differently from how we use it today. It's not thought that experience is some transparent thing that simply has to be respected in front of, where you just bow down in front of this thing called experience. People used to understand that experience is always processed through ideological lenses, which are themselves the products of histories. So to ask why is it that Jews feel a certain kind of paranoia, we would have to ask questions about legacies of the Holocaust and the State of Israel, which have analogues. So for example, when I campaigned in some constituencies in the 2019 election with large British Indian populations, Hindu populations, I saw a genuine kind of paranoia that Labour's declared support for Kashmiri freedom at the 2019 conference, which Keir Starmer has of course reversed, just as he's reversed most of the Labour Party's support for freedom for the oppressed around the world. I saw real anxieties that was just a fig leaf for expressing racism against British Indians. Now, to me, this seems strange. I knew that people who voted to support freedom for Kashmiris just wanted freedom for Kashmiris. But if you are a British Indian who comes from a community which knows that it was systematically abused by European states, and then found its security and stability in a post-colonial world by constructing a nation state for itself, and then that nation state was entangled in the oppression of others, it's easy to understand the proclamations from yesterday's abusers of you, the new proclamations of solidarity with these new oppressed, as just the latest mechanism for targeting you. And so just as British Indians felt that way, and it was strange to me, my grandparents and others in my family, lots of British Jews feel that way about declarations of solidarity with Palestine. So I think we have to do two things. We have to avoid two mistakes. We have to avoid both the kind of cynicism which says everyone's acting in bad faith. You know, these two people who go on TV and say they'll leave if Corbyn wins, they're just part of some right-wing conspiracy and they're lying. You know, it may well be that they're speaking honestly, and we have to have an understanding of where their paranoias and anxieties come from. We have to avoid cynicism about them, and we also have to avoid a kind of credulity that says we must simply bow down in front of their lived experience. Instead, we should be confident that anti-racist principles means fighting racism. It doesn't just mean listening to what X person says because they come from Y category. So, you know, if an African-American conservative in the United States says that they oppose affirmative action as racist and patronizing, as they frequently say, an anti-racist would have an understanding of both why affirmative action is important and why Black conservatives have come to feel that way, and what's the historical production of their consciousness and how they've come to feel kind of attacked and undermined, and why they speak that way, rather than saying, because they're a Black person and they say this, I must simply bow down before them. But I know that my view is a kind of old-fashioned one, about a kind of old-fashioned mid-century anti-racism, radical anti-racism from the 1950s to 70s that you see in people like Fanon, which I think is very different from the contemporary trend. So others may disagree with me, but I think the fetish for lived experience has got us into a lot of trouble here.
Brilliant. And I mean, we've got the next question that's just come in from Chris, linking back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier about, you know, Lisa Nandy has said that anti-Semitism is a form of racism that punches up. What do you think of that statement?
Yeah, so I was trying to talk about this earlier. If you simply say those words, anti-Semitism punches up, then you are, of course, reiterating the anti-Semitic trope, because in saying anti-Semitism genuinely attacks the powerful, you are agreeing that Jews are powerful. To be fair to her, Lisa Nandy didn't simply say that. Anti-Semitism claims to punch up. It thinks of itself as attacking the powerful. That's true. It's just very superficial to stop the analysis there, but very powerful, because if you stop the analysis there, then you say anti-Semites are unlike other kinds of racists who belong on the right because they attack the weak and the poor and the disadvantaged, because anti-Semites at least imagine themselves attacking the rich and the powerful, and therefore they're left-wing. Well, if you've ever opened any tabloid newspaper and seen the way they rave about everyone from union barons to EU bureaucrats, you would know that anti-elitism is not the preserve of the left. The right constructs all kinds of elites. The fundamental difference, though, is that the elites that the left targets are products of a social relation of, say, capital accumulation. So, in order to have a society premised on capital accumulation, as we do, you have to have capitalists and workers, and some very powerful groups of capitalists might then influence government policy. They might form an elite. Not that capitalist society is reducible to that elite, but it might create elites. Whereas on the right, the elites imagined are separate from that process of social relations, so that you can attack them without attacking the structure of social relations. So for a right-winger, a union baron, that is someone who's elected to represent their workers, is more likely to be a kind of horrible elite, part of a horrible elite, than a banker or a billionaire. Or a government bureaucrat or a university professor who has left-wing ideas that the right doesn't like. These are the elites imagined by the right, who are importantly distinct from the structure of social relations, of capitalist wealth and capitalist power, so that you can have an anti-elitism that attacks these nominal elites, which channel anti-elitist feelings in the direction of targeting elites in a way that doesn't actually take down the basic structure of your hierarchical, alienating and exploitative society. That is the structure of right-wing anti-elitism, and anti-Semitism is the kind of classic case, the exemplary case of right-wing anti-elitism. So yes, it thinks of itself punching up, but that doesn't mean that it's radical. And much more importantly, perhaps for our contemporary politics, the way that it identifies elites is by conjuring them as ethnically or culturally different. And in that respect, it follows on from the form of politics which was mainstreamed in this country by New Labour and other forces after the War on Terror, which said the political antagonisms that define our lives are cultural antagonisms. We face off against the threat of jihadi extremism or whatever it is, these people who are utterly alien and different from us. And if you see how anti-Semitism, yes, punches up, but also punches up in a way that's ethnically or culturally defined, then you take a lot of the wind out of Lisa and Andy's sails, because you'd show how it's a form of thinking that is much more indebted to liberal and conservative narratives in Britain over recent years that come out of the War on Terror than it is indebted to anything that comes out of the left.
Absolutely. I think that may be the last question that we've had in, or oh no, so we've got one that's just come in now. From Aaron, asking, how do we ensure that the recommendations of the EHRC report, that the issues of racism in the party are dealt with through an effective process, as opposed to sort of political priorities and, political intervention?
Well, where to start with this question? I think that part of the problem of the EHRC's liberal anti-racism is present in their insistence on treating anti-racism as a kind of technical matter. So that one of the central complaints of the report is the idea that the leader's office interfered politically in cases. Now, that's an interesting kind of complaint. It seems to me that if the leader's office is interfering to try to protect anti-Semites, then that's a political problem. If they're interfering, as they claim they sometimes did, to speed up action against anti-Semites, to object that the bureaucracy isn't being speedy enough in kicking out anti-Semites, for example, then that would be much less of a problem for anti-racists. But if you have a liberal view that there is a kind of public sphere defined by reasonableness, and there's an obviously unreasonable fringe of cranks and bigots who have to be kicked out of that public sphere, and that can be handled by a totally apolitical technical body, then it doesn't matter what the leader's office is doing. Any political interference in the process is a problem. So I don't share that view that anti-racism should be regarded as a technical, administrative, apolitical process, which is the responsibility of some independent body. I want socialists running my anti-racism, not just any socialists, but socialists who I trust, and this is not true of all of them, to be genuinely committed anti-racists. I have comrades who I trust much more to make the right decisions about fighting racism than I would trust some right-wing journalist who, happens to apply for a job in a sort of anti-racist charity or something. So I am skeptical of the EHRC's focus on the need for processes to be politically independent, even as I, of course, accept the core of it, which is a suggestion that the fight against racism should be premised on principle rather than personal loyalty, and it shouldn't be a case of people intervening to protect their friends. And of course, you should have proper processes to ensure that can't happen. But the idea the Labour Party now has a few weeks to design a totally independent process for kicking out bigotries from its ranks, I think just speaks to the lack of seriousness of this. If you really believed, as it was claimed under Corbyn, that there was an existential problem of rife anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, then you would not say that in a few weeks you should design some technical process that can just boot out all the anti-Semites. You would have to do the more old-fashioned Marxist thing, the work of ideology critique, of saying, what is it about our society that has generated this kind of thinking, rather than just treating it as a few bad apples that can be kicked out of the barrel, and then you can all sleep easy at night and smile and say, we've kicked out the racist idiots, we're all happy anti-racists. You should instead go, I think, for the more radical option of thinking Britain is a society which has long had racism running through it. That's what it means to be an imperial nation. And anti-Semitism has been a presence in Britain since the Middle Ages, and it remains one. And don't treat it, as I think the EHRC sometimes comes too close to treating it, as a marginal problem of a few idiots who go on TV and shout off, as Ken Livingstone might have done. The problem's much broader than that.
Definitely, I think you've touched obviously on lots of different points and made references to various different things. So Louis has asked, would you recommend any specific literature for people to kind of read further, or any videos that you find particularly good?
There is so much. There is so much that I would recommend. In thinking about anti-Semitism, I find Jean-Paul Sartre's essay, Anti-Semite and Jew, to be a great kind of starting point, as well as very influenced by Sartre, Fanon's work in Black Skin, White Masks, which is so powerful for connecting his anti-colonialism and anti-racism to the fight against anti-Semitism, much forgotten today, and I wish it were revived and remembered, because unlike these new anti-Semites who treat anti-Semitism as a disease of the radical fringe, Fanon is writing as a radical, militant, anti-colonial intellectual who sees anti-Semitism as a disease of colonial society, similar to what he calls negrophobia, hatred of Black people and the colonized. So Black Skin, White Masks is worth scouring for its references to anti-Semitism. Similarly, the chapter on anti-Semitism in Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment is a kind of classic reference point, and Moïse Pastone's work, which I can send people who are interested. These things have all been influential for me, though I have disagreements with actually all of them, not really with Fanon actually, but with all the others I have various kinds of disagreements. So these are kind of foundational works for thinking about anti-Semitism. There's been much less, I mean, Pastone has done work recently. There's been much less contemporary work thinking seriously about anti-Semitism from the left. I have a debate with my friend Cy Englert in this journal Salvage. So I wrote a long article called Jewophobia. He replied to it. And in the next issue of the journal, which is coming out very soon, I have a response to him. And I would, I hope people would find that debate interesting as a debate about how the left should think about anti-Semitism. So, those are some kind of classic reference points. I know that it's a bit intimidating when I say, well, go and read Sartre and go and read Fanon and go and read the Adorno and Horkheimer chapter on anti-Semitism, though it's very famous, is quite difficult. So is the Pastone essay. I have tried today and in other kind of media appearances and stuff I've done to present these arguments in a way that is clear and not too complicated, because I do find the most useful accounts of anti-Semitism largely come from academia and from leftists of different kinds in academia, and they can often be quite intimidating. So I'm trying to sort of make them simpler, but I'd caution you that many of the simple and easy accounts that you'll find of anti-Semitism all over the internet tend to be pretty crap, so be careful.
Brilliant. I think that's the last question we've had in. So thank you to everybody for coming. And of course, thank you so much to Barnaby for doing genuinely probably the best event we've had. We've had some pretty cracking events over the years so far. So I think everyone seems to have been pretty amazed by that. So thank you so much. I hope I'll let you all go off and have your dinners now. And yeah, we'll see you with our next event, which should, I believe, be a Green New Deal based event, an environmental event. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, right.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone.
No problem, no problem. It's been a pleasure. Okay. Goodbye. There we go.